Howdy, of you delicious people. I am here today to talk about American Gods, ultimately, Season 1, Episode 3 and 4. So, I was kind of chatting with, I was chatting with a person on one of my social medias, and ultimately, I don't know, this show just kind of popped in there, and so ultimately I was like asking him, like, well, hey, like, have you ever seen this show? And ultimately that led into like a conversation of like me going like, oh, okay, well, I don't know about the show. I don't know about this show. Ultimately, the person that I asked if they had seen the show, ultimately they had like read the book, they had seen the entire show, and a billion other things that I've probably never heard of in my life. Probably they know about everything and I don't, which is perfectly interesting and or great because ultimately that's the interesting thing about conversation. That's the ultimate thing about getting to know somebody eventually at some point in time where reasonably it's just like, oh, well, that's fascinating. It's like oh, wow, that's like ultimately you get some like insights from some people where ultimately they have like they know much more than you do, and it's like, oh, okay, now I can finally quasi understand this show a little bit more. So hence why I wanted to like start watching it again. Because in the end, I was just kind of like, okay, like I'm trying to wrap my head around like who these people are. Why are they doing the things that they're doing? And ultimately, I'm trying to make the consensus of who like some of these folks are in this show. And so ultimately, when watching these episodes, like I'm like, okay, I think I'm coming to a closer consensus. But ultimately, like with ultimately also kind of finding out that it seems like these people are all like gods of sorts. So we have it to where every single like person like is kind of like a Norse god in my kind of noggin, in my kind of where you'd have like the Norse gods, where ultimately you have like Thor, the god of thunder, and Loki, the god of mischief, and you also have like a lot of the other Norse gods, where I think like one god is like the god of partying and all these other kind of flimsy kind of things. We have like the god of messengers and the god of speed and the god of war and the god of kittens. I'm sure at some point. But yeah, so going into this show, like immediately, I'm just like, I'm still really liking this show. There is like moments where I'm just like, okay, this is actually really great that they are continually having this person come back. Ultimately, the guy who I called the Leprechaun, who is Mad Sweeney, I'm like, oh, great. They're consistently bringing him in to be on the show, which ultimately I'm like, okay, I didn't think there probably was going to have him be on the show. Excuse me, on the show past the first episode, but they keep bringing him back. I'm like, okay, this is really good. Um, I really like how there is like it almost kind of feels like there is some maybe unconventional like speaking within this show. There is some kind of like roundabout way of how they talk about things. Like it doesn't seem like the normal way of which to go, and like it almost seems that almost like every word is like kind of almost like Shakespearean at some way, where it's like we have some way of like putting insults to somebody, but they're doing it in like a roundabout way. Like when somebody would say like, okay, well, like I want you to go to this location and find this thing. Like somebody just doesn't go like, well, okay, well, clearly, like that's ultimately what you want me to do. That's great, and so see you later. Bye. That's not how they speak, which I find that fascinating. Um, like they kind of have to go a roundabout way to ultimately kind of like, okay, well, I heard what you just said, but I'm gonna kind of like reel it back to you as an insult, which I think this dialogue is so interesting when hearing it more often within this show, because I think the first two episodes you had Shadow kind of like fighting. there's a lot of quietness. There's like a lot of quiet desperation in these first two episodes. But I think now there is much more dialogue, so I can understand kind of like how everyone is talking more, because it seems like there was a lot of points in time where you would just be watching like Shadow like walk for long periods of time, or ultimately you would just see him just be in like an environment somewhere, just kind of waiting somewhere. So it was a lot of eating up of time, just seeing a visual of sorts. But now it seems like we get more dialogue, which is great. So I'm probably going to be talking about episode 3 and 4, and I'm probably going to be talking about them in a very roundabout like way. So or just kind of like there's going to be tangents galore that happen probably within this episode. So ultimately, if there's something that I ultimately say out of turn, or if anything, there might be like some stuff that is just kind of like here and there and it doesn't quite make sense to where the episode goes exactly, then I do apologize. But also, justifiably, there is just a lot of crap that ends up also going into these shows as well. Wait a minute. Okay. I look at a name and I'm like, wait a minute, what? Like, ultimately, me finding out that name, I'm like, wait a minute. So, is there another uh, Yora? Is there two Yoras in the show? Okay, mood point. I have to get back into. Okay, so we really have it to where in these two episodes we are ultimately not showcasing we're ultimately not showcasing much of uh Bilquis, who ultimately I found out is ultimately a god of fertility, which I'm ultimately like, oh, okay. All right. So, okay, so now I can understand why she kept consuming people. All right, because ultimately I was trying to like figure out like who these people were, and so now ultimately hearing some knowledge, of course, of who people were. Like I still don't know who Mister Wednesday is because I don't think I want to know, but ultimately I'm kind of fascinated um, when seeing like when seeing characters like Salim, or ultimately seeing a Jin evidently arrive onto this show, or the Jin, who ultimately is a cab driver, I believe. Uh, but anyways, we eventually also get to also see Death. We also get to see Death in this show. So I thought that was kind of fascinating because like the next two episodes really kind of tie Death in and talk about it. Um, but anyways, I just thought that this like I'm kind of having a hinting suspicion about Shadow Moon of sorts. Like I'm wondering if quite possibly that Shadow Moon could ultimately be a god of sorts, and ultimately I don't know it yet. Uh, like it seems like he has an ability of sorts, and I'll have to talk about that once we actually get into spoilers. Because ultimately, I don't know, something seems quite like, especially in in this very first, this third episode. I'm like, you know what? There's got to be something with this that ultimately makes me think that like Shadow Moon is a god of something, but I'm not quite sure exactly if it's true or not. It could just be coincidence. So we ultimately push on to ultimately have seemingly some closure, or seemingly like something that we hinted about earlier in these first two episodes are now going to be fully fledgedly uh, put out into these episodes to actually show us every bit of everything. Um, And interestingly enough, we have Dane Cook that is also within these two episodes, which I'm like, oh, to me, I'm like, okay, I'm like, hey, Dane Cook is in this show. I'm like, wow, that's amazing. Like, it's been a while since I've seen Dane Cook do much of anything, with the exclusion of like employee of the month and any kind of time where he would do a stand up or whatever. But it's great always seeing him doing a movie or doing something. I remember him in Mr. Brooks and so on and so forth. So they ultimately have to have now pushing forward. Let's go into spoilers. Let's go into spoilers about these episodes. I'm going to try my best to try to remember everything, but good God. There's a lot going on, and there's some stuff where it's kind of like, okay, why was that even a scene in this show? Why was that a scene in the show? Because I didn't understand, like, I didn't quite understand the gravity of it. And so ultimately, I was just kind of like, okay, like, there's some interesting visuals here, but I'm not quite understanding like what this person means to this story. Like that's the whole thing. Um, like I don't know what their backstory is because evidently I wish that they would have like at the bottom like God of something or like give people like a stupid like layman's term thing of like, oh, this guy is the God of whoever. Like, oh, okay, all right. Like once they perform whatever their act is, then ultimately it's understandable that like this person now is this kind of person and whichever one have you. So let's ultimately go into the double five timed territory. I'm probably going to foul up this review, but I hope I can just get through these two episodes. I think that's ultimately why reasonably I was just trying as much as possible to just do one episode at a time because I feel like every episode is very complicated. And so ultimately that's probably why I'll like I know I really want to bang out this show, but I also want to like I really want to kind of finish this first season to get into the second season, because ultimately I heard full well that it's like make sure like hey you like get to season through season two, because season three is coming up soon, so like hey really get through this. And ultimately I'm like yeah I'm really actually really enjoying the show. Like visually there's some interesting things about it, and just like there's a lot of characters that are kind of popping up that I'm just able to really invest in, like the Leprechaun, which is Mad Sweeney, and ultimately just kind of like seeing these journeys of these characters because I kind of like their interactions with all the other people. Mr. Wednesday, like I'm really enjoying his interactions with Shadow Moon. I'm freaking enjoying Shadow Moon just because reasonably, like he's not a fighter right now. Uh, he's really just kind of trying to understand what is all like going on. He's trying to like grasp what he's really seeing, and I think that that is just so fascinating to see Shadow Moon being pushed down this rabbit hole, and for him to try to uh, like he's trying to understand what is going on. He's trying to put the pieces together, or he's trying to like he's kind of like a detective that is trying to like solve all this stuff, and he's asking people that aren't going to give him answers. And so that is like the interesting thing. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time I'm going to spoil this show. So ultimately, this third episode is realistically to seemingly have us find out that Mr. Wednesday and Zoria Venergia Zoria, the girl that was ultimately in the home with uh, Checkenbog, Checkenbog, Chickenbog, Checkensbog. Yeah, the guy, the Peter Stormore, who ultimately had the sledgehammer. Where ultimately he evidently takes a sledgehammer and smacks the head on cattle, and ultimately he takes one sledge, and ultimately that kills cattle. It seems like we find that his ability is to one hit people with the sledgehammer and ultimately kill them. So at the very tail end of the very last episode, we have it to where seemingly we find out where Shadow Moon and Checkonsbog ultimately are playing checkers, and ultimately Shadow Moon loses. To ultimately, we have to where Shadow Moon is ultimately asking, "Hey, like, how about double or nothing? We play checkers again, and we'll see if ultimately, like at this point, if I win or I lose or whatever, then ultimately that'll say if Checkensbog uh, is ultimately going to finally kill Shadow Moon or not, or ultimately if uh, Shadow Moon is going to take the hit and not die, and ultimately Checkensbog is ultimately going to just be relegated to probably or quite possibly being too old and stuff like that. But ultimately, uh, if it doesn't take one hit to kill Shadow Moon, then Shadow Moon's like, well, like, yeah, you'll just be an old man, and ultimately, like, there's nothing wrong with that. Ultimately, like, I won't tell anybody that it took you two hits to kill me, and so on and so forth. So ultimately, we have Mr. Wednesday that is ultimately talking to Zoria, and we find out that it seems that they are. It seems like they've had a relationship with one another, hence why Mr. Wednesday had brought stuff to her. We ultimately have them both go outside, and Zoria is ultimately talking about, like, well, it's raining, and Mr. Wednesday's like, I don't think you've ever had a problem before about getting wet, huh? Like, kind of like, yeah, like, kind of like really showcasing that these two have had some kind of romantic connection with one another. Um, we also have to seemingly showcase that that Mr. Wednesday and uh, and Shadow Moon are ultimately going to go out, and they are ultimately going to put something together, uh, put together some uh, like plan of sorts, put something together. We ultimately have it to where Mr. Wednesday is consistently trying to rework Shadow Moon's mind. Ultimately, having Mr. Wednesday consistently telling him, it's like, think of snow. Think of snow. Like, ultimately, think of like hard traveling snow. Just keep thinking of snow. And so reasonably, like, Mr. Wednesday is trying to like uh like show him like clouds, whatever. He's like, think of those clouds being dark and everything, like trying to really give him the visual of helping him like try to like remind himself of snow and this and that. And so we have it to where eventually, while Mr. Wednesday is doing his job, uh we have it to where Shadow Moon eventually is kind of nodding off, and so eventually Mr. Wednesday like goes and gets him, and ultimately we see out the window that ultimately Shadow Moon had quite possibly made snow. And so while Mr. Wednesday and Shadow Moon are ultimately driving away, we have it to where Shadow Moon is asking, it's like, did I make it snow? And Mr. Wednesday is like, are you kidding me? Like, you're the person that like doesn't believe in magic. You're a person that like needs a real scientific answer for everything. And but Shadow Moon is like, yeah, but did I make it snow? Like, did I make it snow? And Mr. Wednesday is just like you're the guy that did, like, like I can't really tell you if you made snow. Like I can't tell you that. So I'm thinking, I'm like, well, does Shadow Moon have the power and ability of weather? Because ultimately, in the fourth episode, um, we have it to where Shadow Moon is calling someone. Let's just say, because spoilers towards the very end of this episode, but to not spoil the end of this episode, but we have it to where Shadow Moon is ultimately calling someone and mentioning weather again. So I'm like, so yeah, like Shadow Moon um must have something to do with weather. I'm not sure what it is. I can't quite put my finger on it, but like I feel like Shadow Moon has something to do with weather bizarrely. I'm not quite sure what exactly that is. I could be completely wrong, but when looking at it, like, what is he? What is he going to be? Like the god of thieves, or the god of weather, or whatever it could be? Like, I don't know. It could be possible. So, but no spoilers, anybody. No spoilers. No spoilers. So we ultimately have it to where eventually Mr. Wednesday is getting Shadow Moon some cocoa, and ultimately I thought that that was like a really funny, nice moment where like Mr. Wednesday's like, "Well, do you like it with marshmallows and like this and that?" And ultimately, like Shadow Moon's like, "Yeah, I like it with marshmallows," as he walks off and just like. So eventually they go and they sit down somewhere, and eventually we have it to where we have Leprechaun, or we ultimately have Mad Sweeney, who ultimately is seemingly thumbing it through the road or through the streets and whichever one have you. And so ultimately we find that the Leprechaun's luck has run out. That ultimately it's not going that well because because ultimately he doesn't have his lucky coin, his lucky cold trickle coin with him, and so ultimately we have the leprechaun who is ultimately thumbing it, and we have some guy who is ultimately talking to him like, "Hey man, how about you come in my car? Like I'll give you a ride to wherever you need to go." And so ultimately he goes in there and the guy is talking to him like, oh yeah, like it seems like you're trying to recover from something, because ultimately this guy is talking to him like he's an alcoholic, and ultimately that he's uh like that's the reason why he's thumbing it everywhere, he's hitchhiking it everywhere, that he's a drunk. And so ultimately this guy is trying to rehabilitate him and ultimately tell him like, hey man, like if you want to go to a meeting or you want to talk about it, it's just like this guy doesn't want to get anything off his chest, because really it's just like, dude, like I just like I just want to, like, if you want to drive me, then like, hey, let's go, but like I don't have the best of luck right now. So we find that the driver of his car gets a freaking like pipe through his mouth, and ultimately ends up dying, to where the leprechaun of course can't ultimately drive the car anyway, so he just walks out. We ultimately find it to where the leprechaun makes his way uh, to Shadow Moon and Mr. Wednesday, and ultimately we have it to where the leprechaun is asking Shadow Moon, it's like, hey, where is my coin? Like, you had my coin. That was my one and lucky coin that you had. I gave you the wrong coin. I gave you my lucky coin. And now I don't have my luck anymore. Where is my coin? And so ultimately Shadow Moon is like, well, okay, like I'll tell you where your coin is if ultimately you can tell me how you did that trick. How did you get that coin from out of the air? And ultimately we have the leprechaun that mentions, it's like, well, like exactly, that's what I did. I plucked it from out of the air. That's how I did it. And Shadow Moon's just like, yeah, sure, whatever. So ultimately, Shadow Moon mentions that the coin is in Indiana, where ultimately his wife is resting. So it's on the coffin of Laura Moon's uh, Laura Moon's coffin. So we have it to where now Leprechaun has to make his way all the way to Indiana to try to uncover this grave so ultimately he can get his coin. Pushing on. So we ultimately have it to where in this thing that what else was there in this episode? What else is going on? Um, I'm not quite sure where exactly this fit in here. I could be wrong. Of no, I think this was in episode 3. We ultimately have some man who ultimately goes and things are quite possibly going wrong for him, and ultimately he ends up going into some taxi cab, and it seems that uh, we have Salim, who ultimately I know from being the villain in Venom, and we have this Jin character who is ultimately a taxi driver. So we have it within here that ultimately we have seemingly this Jin that is seemingly going to grant this guy a wish of sorts, and because ultimately this guy's life is going horribly awry, the taxi driver's life is going horribly awry, and so we have to where it seemingly Salim is bizarrely like touching on this taxi driver, like touching his shoulder and everything like that, and then bizarrely we lead into a scene where it seems like both of these men are in the bedroom, let's just say together, and it seems like the Jin is consuming this person after this wish. And so that leads to this person just kind of going off on their own way to eventually be the new taxi driver. So it seems like this Jin is ultimately like granting wishes in this in this taxi cab, and ultimately that's I guess the way of easily just being like like kind of hiding in plain sight to ultimately get wishes granted from people and ultimately consume them afterwards. So we have it to where the leprechaun is ultimately going and unearthing this grave ultimately to get his lucky coin. But here's a problem. We ultimately have it to where the leprechaun cannot find his lucky coin, and so he opens the coffin to find out that there is absolutely nothing in the coffin. It's like, so what? So, in the very next episode, episode 4, we find out that ultimately that Laura Moon had come back from the dead, bizarrely. Because ultimately we have an entire episode about death, or Anubis, the god of death. Ultimately, it seems like within this episode we have like a very Egyptian-like theme because of course it's Anubis, the god of death, and so reasonably like I was like okay, I can understand this. I'm like, oh, all right, like this is the reason why we have this like Egyptian theme for this specific god in this episode, I guess. Excuse me. So we have it to where ultimately it's to show us that death ultimately has like he takes a woman, and ultimately what he ends up doing is he finds her dead, and so ultimately he takes her and shows her that she is dead, she's lying on the ground somewhere, and so ultimately he takes her onto I guess what would be a quasi like judgment place, um to where death is ultimately going to take this woman's heart and like pull it out of her, and she's like, "Dude, I needed that," and he's ultimately just like, yeah, "What? You're dead. You're dead." So he rips her heart out of her and puts it on this kind of equalizer, this equilibrium thing. He has one side with a feather, and he has one side with uh, like when you see like the symbol for liberty, uh, like liberty and justice, and like when you see like a court thing, like the symbol where you have like this pendulum looking thing where it kind of like has to weigh the pros and cons kind of thing, and like it kind of like goes like a teeter totter upside like down, and then eventually comes to like some equal kind of thing, um, an equalizer of sorts. So we have it to where a feather is on one side and the heart is on one side, and ultimately this scale ultimately like it gets to like showcasing. We have it to where this woman is kind of mentioning all the wrong things that she has done, but ultimately there's kind of very few things. Like ultimately she mentions that she like treated one of her boyfriends like crap, and she did some other horrible thing as well. um and so reasonably, Death is just like, "Oh, okay, well, it seems like you're like telling me the truth and everything like that." Well, and then so ultimately he takes her to door number 1 through 5 to ultimately have her decide which door to of God to worship. To ultimately mention like, hey, which uh 1 through 5, which I guess heaven do you want to go to? Which door do you want to choose to worship some god? Because evidently it seems like people have numerous different options of their kind of heaven that they want, and so ultimately we have it to where this woman ultimately goes through a door and she's like, hopefully I'm going through the right door because ultimately I want my Titia or whatever this girl or this person that she knows. Hopefully my daughter makes the same choice and whatever. So ultimately I can see her again. We have this woman go through this door, and so that's all good and great and whatever. So we now have to showcase that the reason why the leprechaun did not have somebody in that coffin is because ultimately we have it uh, to where Laura Moon ultimately dies as well. Here's the thing that I ultimately skipped about in episode 3, and I'll tailor back to, because I completely forgot about this. Crap. Let's not break that rhythm of what I was going to say, and then I'll go back to it right after this moment. So we have it to where Laura Moon ultimately is being confronted by death, and ultimately Laura Moon is Shadow Moon's wife, and ultimately we find it that to where Laura ultimately is to be judged, and so reasonably we have it to where Death is going to pull her heart out, and Laura won't allow him to do this. And ultimately, she is just like ultimately telling him where the scale is absolutely going to lie, or where it's going to end up being. Like she's basically telling him, it's like, dude, whatever you're gonna give me, good or bad, it's like, psh, like that's what I deserve. Like you don't have to rip out my heart and tell me where I'm supposed to go. Like I know full well that I'm ultimately going to end. It's probably going to end up badly for me. So whichever, like, come on, let's go. So eventually, Laura is kind of really like fighting against this guy Death, and ultimately we have it to where Laura eventually seemingly gets sucked out of this death environment, and ultimately we find out that she climbs her way from this coffin, and ultimately she is ending up vomiting, I guess, embalming fluid. To ultimately find out that she's consistently trying to release all this embalming fluid that ultimately gets put into every death person. We ultimately find out that Laura is ultimately a zombie of sorts, because reasonably she ends up having to come out of being dead and seemingly being a zombie. Ultimately, her arm ultimately like falls off of her, and so we end up having Laura ending up fighting, I guess, other zombies, I guess, and ultimately she just kind of rips through them, or just beats the living crap out of a lot of them. And I thought that this was really fascinating, this whole fight out bizarrely, which I didn't quite understand what all was really going on, but I thought it was fascinating. So here's where I will put a pin in that, and I will go back to an earlier episode, or the earlier episode. So we ultimately have Shadow Moon, ultimately the time on which where he was supposedly sleeping, and so ultimately you have it to where Shadow Moon was talking to a girl named Zoria something or other, and ultimately he was trying to figure out the name, and ultimately she was saying it right. And I was like, ultimately, I'm like, okay, wait a minute. I'm like, is she a younger version of this girl that is ultimately coming to him in his dream? Like, what is going on here? I'm a little confused. And ultimately, we have this girl that is ultimately at this telescope and ultimately looking out on it and ultimately talking about um, Odin's Wayne, and ultimately talking about the stars and all of this stuff. We have it to where this Zoria ultimately wants to do one thing, uh, and that is to kiss Shadow Moon. Told me she has never been kissed, and she wants to like see how it feels. She ultimately kisses him, and ultimately is like, yeah, that's kind of disgusting. It kind of feels like a thing of bread or a brandy. It's kind of like a bitter kind of thing. And to ultimately we have it to where this your Zoria is ultimately mentioning that she is going to give Shadow Moon the moon, like really like taking it from out of the sky and making it into a coin to give to Shadow Moon. And then ultimately, shortly thereafter, that is when Shadow Moon wakes up. I'm like, okay, that made no rational sense. And ultimately, like when going into, I think the reason why I left it out was just because I'm like, okay, what did that mean? What did any of that mean? Was it just like Shadow Moon just having a weird, nonsensical dream, which ultimately, again, probably felt very real because he's so confused what reality is and what dreaming is? Because ultimately, when he made it snow, he is thinking that he is dreaming, but ultimately, Mr. Wednesday had to convince him. It's like, well, like, how is that you're dreaming, but you're all full well and awake? Like this makes no sense. To where Shadow Moon is still asking about like snow and how he made how he made snow. But anyways, pushing on. So back at Laura. So Laura is, I would have to assume a cadaver, a zombie, whatever you want to call her. She's that. But it doesn't seem like she's nibbling on anybody yet, so I don't know. Will she eat people? Don't know. Anyways, we have it to where Laura lost an arm. Excuse me. And ultimately, she is trying to figure out how to put this arm back upon her body. And it seems like she tries to sew her arm back on, but it doesn't seem like it's going all that well. And it gets to a point to where eventually she is trying to clean up her home, trying to uh, find some stuff here and there. Because what ends up happening is at the tail end of episode 3, we have Shadow Moon who comes back to his place to ultimately find Laura Moon there, and he's ultimately freaking out. So we have to kind of show like the before that moment happens. So this is happening well before, like this is more than likely this is happening from that coin moment on. So when Shadow Moon put the coin on on Laura's grave, I guess that's what spurned her to be a zombie, I guess. So basically, from whatever Shadow Moon was doing from then on to get back to that point, that's when Laura was coming back. So, but interestingly enough, we also have to show like Laura Moon's and Shadow Moon's like entire relationship as well. We have to show how they met, because ultimately Shadow Moon had been trying to uh, work this casino and try to uh, ultimately try to like count cards and ultimately try to like do tricks to ultimately try to uh, try to work this casino, and ultimately we have it to where this card counter like sees everything that he's doing, and that ultimately that card counter is Laura Moon. And so recently Laura Moon is telling Shadow Moon, it's like, dude, like I know exactly what you're doing, and I'm gonna be honest, it's like, dude, ultimately like somebody's gonna break your knees. Somebody's gonna break your kneecaps. Like if anything, like you're gonna be found out, you're gonna go to jail and you're gonna go away for a long time. You're either gonna be killed or go to prison, whatever, but you're gonna go away for a long time. Like, dude, like there's cameras all over here, they know exactly what you're doing, and like don't like if anything, play one hand and then leave. Uh we ultimately have it to where Laura ultimately bizarrely she liked Shadow Moon bizarrely, and so she ultimately was trying to be nice to him, even though he was an a hole. But she was trying to be nice to him anyways, bizarrely. So she just took a liking to him for some weird way, and I just don't quite understand why. So we ultimately have it to where Laura and Shadow Moon. We ultimately have Shadow Moon very appreciative of Laura going out of her way to protect him, and so ultimately that led Shadow Moon to go back to Laura while she was making her way home, and Shadow Moon's like, "Yeah, I really appreciate you trying to help me and everything like that." It's like ultimately we have Shadow Moon that's kind of asking her. It's like, "Well, hey, like maybe it would be better off if I had an inside man to help me try to uh, to break open into this place." And so Laura doesn't think about it now. Like the only thing that she was thinking about was going home. And you have it to where like Shadow Moon's like, well, yeah, take me home. To ultimately we have it to where Laura and Shadow Moon both go home to consistently go at it uh, on the couch. To ultimately Laura ends up like slapping Shadow Moon to ultimately like say, yeah, I want it aggressive. I want it the way I want it. But it seems like more and more they continue to go at it, let's just say, and ultimately Laura is just kind of like going through the motions and stuff like that. And ultimately to where uh, Laura is finally, again, being brutally honest with Shadow Moon, just like, you know what, like, I'm just, like, I'm kind of getting bored. Like, it's like there's nothing going on. Like, if anything, I think we should really try to, like, I'll be that inside man and we'll try to crack open this casino and and do that thing that you were talking about earlier. Uh, but ultimately, Laura mentions that she'll be able to do it better because she's smarter than Shadow Moon is. And Shadow Moon is just like, well, you know what? Like, no, like, I don't want to do this. Like, you know what? I'm happy, and like, ultimately, uh, like I'm happy. It's like, why aren't you happy? And so Laura's just like, I don't know. I think we've just kind of been going through the motions and blah blah blah. So it ends up pushing Shadow Moon ends up pushing into doing this job, and it ends up that Shadow Moon ends up getting caught, and Laura and Shadow Moon are just like, I don't know how we got caught, like who like said anything, bah 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 bah, and so ultimately Laura is saying like, well, hey, how about like I go away for prison, or I go away to prison, and ultimately like Shadow Moon will get a lesser case or lesser time, and Shadow Moon's like, no, like if anything, like I won't rat you out, and like I'll just do the full time, and then I'll probably get time off for good behavior and so on and so forth. So Shadow Moon ends up taking the whole entire time for this crime because Laura ultimately forced him into this whole thing because he was completely fine doing what he was doing, but and we ultimately find out that ultimately Dane Cook's character, ultimately who is the because we have Laura who has a has the friend that ultimately was at the funeral before Audrey. Audrey has a husband named where is he? Where is he? Where is he? Well, his name is Dane Cook. Let's see that. The character that Dane Cook plays. Uh, we'll just have to say Dane Cook because I can't find him because it's gonna take for freaking ever. Yeah, so it's gonna take forever. So it's gonna be Dane Cook. Audrey is with Dane Cook, and we find that Dane Cook's character is trying to get Shadow Moon on the good path. It seems like Dane Cook's character is a person that can train people to fight, and so ultimately, Dane Cook is talking to Shadow Moon like, "Hey man, like, do you want to learn how to fight? Like, I can help you. Like, we can do some training together, and ultimately, I can teach you how to fight." And Shadow Moon's like, "Dude, I can fight." So Dane Cook's like, "Well, hey, do you want to train people on how to fight?" Like, and so ultimately, we have to where eventually Shadow Moon is like training, but then eventually he's, I guess, going to eventually teach people how to fight at some point. So pushing us on to where now when Shadow Moon is gone off to prison, we have Dane Cook that comes in to try to be the shoulder for Laura to quite possibly cry on, but doesn't really seem like Laura is really crying. Because reasonably, Laura ends up coming home one night with her pet dying. I think it's a pet cat. Uh, but, anyways, so we have it to where Laura is calling to have Dane Cook's character get rid of the pet, and ultimately, Dane Cook ultimately takes it out and buries it, and Laura ultimately asks, like, well, is that is that an okay thing to do? Just bury a pet out there, and Dane Cook's just like, yeah, we do it all the time. So Dane Cook is ultimately telling Laura, it's like, well, hey, do you want to come to like our house and just kind of like can spend some time there and just kind of work through your grieving or whatever. And Laura's like, I don't really know that. I don't really know that pet. I didn't really know him. So ultimately, we have it to where Laura is kind of just hugging Dane and all kinds of stuff. And we ultimately have it to where Dane ultimately kisses on Laura. And ultimately, Dane is like, you know, I didn't know what I was thinking. I'm sorry. And we ultimately have it to where Laura's like, well, are you sorry? Are you sorry? And so ultimately it has it to where they end up going right back into kissing one another, and of course doing much more further on to that, leading to the fact where there is a cheating and or affair going on while uh, Shadow Moon is forcibly uh, like now I feel even like crappier just because Shadow Moon like was perfectly fine with the life that he led, but Laura forced him into crime. Told me he did the time for her crime that she wanted him to do because she was just bored, and ultimately, uh, Laura ultimately being with Dane's character ultimately was just her like, yeah, I'm bored. Like I think Laura is a pot stirrer, and everything that she's doing is just because like, well, yeah, I'm bored. Like I have boredom, so ultimately I just kind of want to like we have it to where like when Laura is working in the casino, she is like shuffling all the cards and doing all like her stuff, and we ultimately have the casino people like mentioning to her, it's like, well, dude, we can give you a machine that ultimately can shuffle all the cards for you. It ultimately uh, will make this a lot quicker. And she's ultimately like, no, I don't want to shuffle. I don't want a machine to shuffle my cards. Like ultimately, I want to do it myself because she must be the god of boredom or something. Like she like wants to have excitement because she's just like she doesn't want to get bored. So we have it to where we have like a montaging scene of Shadow Moon repetitiously calling Laura consistently through time. And we are just consistently seeing this cheating relationship going on and on and on. And to ultimately, Laura is just kind of ultimately like kind of treating Dane like he's nothing. Because reasonably, it's like, well, yeah, like you knew what this was, and you knew like there was an expiration date on this relationship, and so on and so forth. To ultimately, when Shadow Moon is going to be released from prison, we have it to where Dane is just kind of like, yeah, you don't really love him. It's like if anything, like if anything, you want to be with me. And Laura's just like, no, like there's an expiration date on this whole affair, and ultimately, like you have like you have outstayed your welcome, kind of thing. So we ultimately have it to where they're kind of making the consensus of this. They're both in the car, and ultimately Laura is giving him one last load to bear, I guess, by having her mouth bear down on his Johnson while they're ultimately listening to some song. And so Dane is by his BJ going on, and so ultimately he ends up in a car accident, which leads us to both Audrey's husband and Shadow Moon's wife dead. So we eventually showcase that Audrey had come back from the grave to ultimately try to get her arm together and eventually to talk to uh, Audrey at some point to ultimately take a crap in her toilet, but then also to scare the crap out of Audrey. And so ultimately they have to kind of talk about the closure moments. Ultimately, we have to have it to where Laura is talking about everything, like kind of confirming what all happened to Audrey's husband, and ultimately if Audrey had found out about them cheating, and it's like, of course she did. If anything, Audrey told every single person in at her funeral that they had cheated and this and that, and ultimately saying that Audrey was bitter and everything like that about the whole affair and this and that. So we have it to where Audrey's trying to figure out what Laura is, if like she's a ghost, if she's haunting her or something. And Laura's like, I don't know what I am. Like all I know is that uh like I come out of the grave and that's all I know. Like and all I know is that I have embalming fluid coming out of all my ends. So that's all I know. So pushing us on to eventually uh, having eventually Laura, we have to where seemingly death ultimately is a curator of these zombie like people, and we ultimately have death and Mr. Um, Ibis, I believe, ultimately taking care of these. taking care of this Laura, and ultimately trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again, especially with her arm, ultimately making it look like she is a actual like corpse of sorts by like painting her like to making her look tanner and all kinds of things, and ultimately talking about her upkeep and everything like that to keep her looking like a normal human being and so on and so forth. So recently we have Laura, who is ultimately getting her upkeep being done, and to ultimately she is putting on a nice dress and ultimately waiting for Shadow Moon to eventually come, which she eventually does, and that's where ultimately the episode tends to just end. So I don't know. I thought these two episodes were just fascinating. Um, I was ultimately trying to like break it down in my head, but when looking at it, I was a little like at some points there was a little bit of confusion. But when looking at this, I really emphatically enjoy how you have Shadow Moon that is like consistently just trying to figure this out, trying to come up with the real consensus of like especially that whole snow thing. Ultimately, I just love how Shadow Moon is trying desperately to figure out if this is like, is he sleeping this whole entire time? Is he awake? Is all this like, is he hallucinating? Is he going crazy? Like what is going on? Like especially that whole thing when he had the whole like every single time he was looking all over the house, he was seeing photos of wangs everywhere. I thought that that was kind of hilarious. And now that we have this moment where ultimately now Shadow Moon is like ultimately assuming that like dude like did I make it snow? And like also when he was talking at some point he was calling Laura at some point in prison, and Shadow Moon was mentioning it's like you know what like he was ultimately uh like Shadow Moon was calling Laura ultimately asking it's like hey like are you okay, like I feel like there's like a disturbance in the force or something, like he's like I think that there's something wrong, like are you okay, um because ultimately he is like you know what there's something like wrong with the weather, there's something like going on with the weather that he just like it just made me feel like there was something wrong today, like there was something going wrong, and I just wanted to call and like ask you and confirm that everything is okay. And I thought that that was like I'm like you know what there's got to be some tie with Shadow Moon and weather, like I don't know what it is yet, I'm trying to figure out what it is, uh and I'm like trying to just like I'm trying to think if like Shadow Moon, like because of the weird name of which he has, but I'm trying to just assume that he must have some like storm ability or something like that. He must be the god of weather or god of something, and so I'm trying to figure that out. And so, but ultimately, again, I'm hoping to not get spoilers. Um, but I'm also still trying to figure out who exactly is Mr. Wednesday. Like I don't know if he's actually like the devil or God. Like I think at first it's like it seems like it seems like Mr. Wednesday actually might be God, just because like I get the whole deal and bargain thing that ultimately might feel like the devil, but like when looking at it, it seems like Shadow Moon is trying to put all these other gods in their place. So when looking at it, I'm like, this ultimately could be God. Mr. Wednesday could be God, and I think that that could make some real rational sense for like God being a smiter of sorts to ultimately if some gods are getting out of place or whatever, and but when looking at it, like I don't think Mr. Wednesday could be the god, because when looking at it, there's always the god of something, and so maybe Mr. Wednesday could be a god of something, but I'm not quite sure yet what exactly that is. The god of knowledge or something, the god of knowing. the god of brain, the god of whatever. I don't know. Like, I don't think he could be the god or the devil, because I think if we're not really going in that kind of terms, if we're kind of going in another kind of route, then yeah, there must just be like, I don't think that like, yeah, it's kind of it's like a brain teaser of trying to figure out who exactly Mr. Wednesday actually is. If he's just a god of something. Um, but it could be just possible that he could possibly like, at first I thought he was the devil, but like if anything, like it seems like Mr. Wednesday through most of these episodes is trying to do, he's trying to do good. He's not trying to like, he's not really trying to go out of his way to like murder and kill a bunch of people or whatever. Like it just seems like he's just trying to exist and kind of like put together or kind of deal with some of the more kind of a-hole gods. But anyways, I think I'm gonna a-hole my way out of here. So, Ayo, goodbye everybody. Goodbye everybody.